Well, we are studying the prophet of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, and we're in the session 11 of the first 12. We're calling the first 12 sessions Unit 1. I'll explain it as we go. And tonight we're going to take a survey of chapters 31 through 35. And we should understand that in the earlier chapters, Isaiah referred to forthcoming judgments in broad terms. And he's going to summarize that again here. The main implication of these chapters that we've been going through is that God does not permit the wickedness of those who have set themselves against the Lord and against his anointed and those who oppose his people to go unpunished. And so God takes himself seriously. And so we're going to complete, both in this session and the following session next Monday, we're going to complete the remainder of Unit 1. And in the previous session, we had looked at chapters 28 through 31, and as Jerusalem is under threat from Assyria, and we're looking to Egypt for protection, if you will, but God taking the position that he's going to defend them, not Egypt. So tonight, we're going to look through the warnings and promises in chapters 32 and 33. We then will focus a little broader. We're going to see Isaiah broaden his focal length, if you will, to embrace Armageddon, the day of the Lord, the end times, and the regathering of Israel. So the scope of his purview here will broaden in this session. And so we're going to take a look at these 31 through 35, these 5 chapters. And that leaves then for us in this unit a historical parenthesis that will close the session in the next session we do next Monday. And that will finish Unit 1. I'll talk more about that when we get through here. Now, Isaiah, of course, is a prophet in the court of Hezekiah. In other words, he was the official prophet for the king. And a very eloquent guy, the most eloquent writer probably in the Old Testament. Now, they clearly were fearful of the Assyrians, which have been conquering the country, and they felt a threat from that. Judah, as it's headquartered in Jerusalem, then turned to Egypt for help, and God frowned upon that, as you'll see as we get into this here. Now, you should also understand Egypt is also typically viewed idiomatically by commentators as an idiom for the world, if you will. And the Pharaoh, being the ruler of that world, is sometimes looked at as an allusion, if you will, to Satan himself as the ruler of the world. So we'll see that used idiomatically here. And as is our style, we're going to take a look at the text from the International Standard Version Bible, primarily because Dr. Peter Flint, who is acknowledged as the expert on the Great Scroll, that is the Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah, has provided us a proprietary translation from the Paleo-Hebrew into English that is a property of the International Standard Version Bible. So we can't resist using that. And we're finding as we compare the ISV with our familiar King James is that clearly the ISV gives us perhaps a better feeling for the eloquence and the flow of Isaiah's presentation. So we'll take a look at chapter 31 starting at verse 1. And this little parsing is where only the Lord can help is the flavor of it. Starting at verse 1. How terrible it be for those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in chariot, because there are so many, and in charioteers, because they are so strong. But do not look to the Holy One of Israel or seek the Lord. So you can understand God's attitude about this. Continuing, yet he is also wise and can bring disaster. He does not take back his words, but he will rise up against the house of those who practice evil and against anyone who assists people who work iniquity. And continuing, the Egyptians are men, not God, and their horses are physical, not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, anyone who assists will stumble, and the one who is helped will fall, and they will all perish together. That's a rather pessimistic look for them, isn't it? Well, let's take a look at the King James to get a flavor of what may be more familiar to our ears here. Isaiah starting chapter 31, verse 1. Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help, and stay on horses and trust in chariots, because they are many, and in horsemen, because they are very strong, and they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord. And of course, chariots, by the way, Pharaoh had at least 600, we understand, and there were 1,200 in the days of Shishak, actually. And so, but we've also noticed here that we have these woes put before us here. And this is number 5 of 6 we've noticed. We'll have one more after this, but there's a series of woes. The ISV doesn't present it that way, but the King James clearly does. They parse it by those six woes. Continue, verse 2. Yet he also is wise who will bring evil and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of the evildoers and against the help of them that work iniquity. And so, now the Egyptians are men, not God, and their horses flesh and not spirit. When the Lord shall stretch out his hand, both he that helpeth shall fall, and he that is hoping shall fall down, and they all shall fall together. So the King James is pretty parallel to the ISV, and I think it's pretty straightforward. So let's move on. The next parsing is emphasizing the Lord will defend Jerusalem. And so picking up verse 4, for this is what the Lord told me, Isaiah says. Just as a lion or a young lion growls over his objects of prey, even when a whole band of shepherds is called out against it, it is not alarmed at their shouting or disturbed by their clamor. So the Lord of the heavenly armies will come down to do battle on Mount Zion and on its hill, like birds hovering overhead. So the Lord of the heavenly armies will protect Jerusalem. He will shield and deliver it, and he will pass over and bring it to safety. Turn back to him, yes, to him whom your people have so greatly betrayed, you people of Israel. For at that time everyone will throw away their idols of silver and their idols of gold that your hands have sinfully made for yourselves. Then Assyria will fall by a sword that is not from human beings only. A sword not wielded by mortal beings will devour them. They will flee from the sword, and their young men will be put to forced labor. Their stronghold will vanish by reason of terror, and their commanders will be filled with alarm because of the battle standard. Declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. So you see what God is saying. The ISV, I think, is clearer, very focused here. That God's saying, "I'll handle it. Don't turn to Egypt, if you will." The King James says, I think, essentially the same thing. It seems a little clearer to me in the ISV, but let's take a look at the King James and picking up at verse 4. For thus hath the Lord spoken unto me, like as the lion and young lion roaring on his prey, when a multitude of shepherds called forth against him. He will not be afraid of their voice, nor abase himself for the noise of them. So shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight for Mount Zion, and for the hill thereof. And as birds flying, in fact, it's really a concept is hovering rather than flying. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also, he will deliver it, and passing over, he will preserve it. A small point here, by the way, in Genesis chapter 1, when the Holy Spirit is moving on the face of the waters, in the second verse of Genesis, the moving there is like brooding and hovering. And that's the same word that's being used here. When you say birds flying, it sounds fluttery. No, this really that the Holy Spirit is hovering over to defend him, and so forth. Moving on, turn ye unto him from whom the children of Israel have deeply revolted. And in that day every man shall cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which your own hands have made unto you for a sin. And so the main point here, God is saying that it's a sure thing that the Assyrians will not take Jerusalem. Everybody's terrified. The Assyrians are threatening them. And so they're turning to Egypt. They shouldn't do that. But God, through Isaiah, is declaring that the Assyrians will not succeed here. And we'll see how dramatically that unfolds here. And so moving on here. Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword not of a mean man shall devour him, and he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be discomfited. And he shall pass over his stronghold for fear, and the princes shall be afraid of the ensign, saith the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, his furnace in Jerusalem. And of course what's going to happen here, as we'll learn, and we're going to see emphasized especially in next week's reading assignment, the sword of the angel is going to interfere here and slaughter 185,000 of the Assyrian army. So God is going to deal with it very forcibly. We're going to discover in next week's reading assignment, there'll be 3 major miracles laid out for Hezekiah in that passage. Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword not of a mean man. In other words, it's an angel that deals with this, not the Egyptian pharaohs or whatever. Now this next segment in chapter 32, starting the first verse, is a bright note, if you will, between the 5th and 6th woes. We just had the 5th woe. We're going to have the 6th woe coming. There's a little bright spot here, a little ray of light to God's people in a dark place in that day. So let's just take a little glimpse here of these 4 verses, the government of justice. Isaiah says, look, a king will reign in righteousness, and rulers will rule with justice. This is obviously future. We don't see any sign of that currently, do we? Each one will be like a shelter from the wind and a hiding place from storms, like streams of water in the desert, in the shadow of a great rock in an exhausted land. Then the eyes of those who can see won't turn away, and the ears of those who can hear will listen. The hearts of reckless people will understand sound judgment, and the tongues of those who stammer will be ready to speak clearly. People will no longer call a fool noble, nor will a bad person be declared honorable. For fools utter contempt, and their minds plot wrong things, practicing ungodliness, spreading lies about the Lord, leaving the pangs of hungry people unsatisfied, and depriving thirsty people of drink. Furthermore, the crimes of bad people are evil, and they devise wicked schemes, destroying the poor with lying words, even when the needy people plead a just cause. But those who are decent plan noble things, and by noble deeds they stand. So that's the answer. It reads pretty straightforward, actually. Let's take a look at it in the King James. It has a couple of surprises coming, I think, here. But in the King James it says, behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes rule in judgment, and man shall be as a hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as a shadow of a great rock in a weary land. And this is obviously a future reminder of the kingdom age which is yet future. And the eyes of them that see shall not be dim, and the ears of them that hear shall hearken. And the heart also of the rash shall understand knowledge, and the tongue of the stammerers shall be ready to speak plainly. And I love this verse. This one's my favorite. The vile person shall no more be called liberal, nor churl said to be bountiful. And it's interesting, up there in verse 3, we're reminded, of course, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12. For now we see through a glass darkly, then face to face. And that's sort of the flavor of verse 3 up there. But I like this. The vile person shall no more be called a liberal. And obviously vile, they mean the foolish person, and liberal, actually the word means generous or noble, if you will, but the way this is expressed, I think, is interesting. It's amazing to me how we are victims of deliberately misguiding vocabulary. And we call the liberals when the real word, liberals aren't liberal, they have an agenda to separate us from our heritage. That's called subversive, not liberal. And then we have the gays who can't escape the fact that that's a form of perversion. And but on it goes. So we deal with that. And the vile person shall no more be called liberal. I like that. For the vile person will speak villainy, and his heart will work iniquity, to practice hypocrisy, and to utter error against the Lord, to make empty the soul of the hungry, and he will cause the drink of the thirsty to fail. And you know how tragic it is. How tragic it is in our culture. People starving for the Word of God. Denied that by the culture, denied that by all kinds of barriers we have to overcome to get the Word of God to the people who are so desperately hungry for it. But moving on, the instruments also of the churl are evil. He devises wicked devices to destroy the poor with lying words, even when the needy speaketh right. But the liberal deviseth liberal things, and by liberal things shall he stand. And okay, so let's move on to verse 9. We're going to now, the ISV calls this next parsing a rebuke for complacent women. I didn't say that. This here in the ISV, so don't give me that glare, girls. Here we go. Verse 9. Isaiah continues, as for you ladies of leisure, get up and listen to my voice. You daughters who feel so complacent, hear what I have to say. In little more than a year, you complacent women will shudder, for the grape harvest will fail, and the fruit harvest will not come. So tremble, you ladies of leisure. Shudder, you daughters who feel so complacent. Strip down and make yourselves naked down to the waist, and wrap yourself in sackcloth and beat your breasts. For people will be beating their breasts in mourning over the pleasant fields, over the fruitful vines, and over the land of my people, overgrown with thorns and briars. Yes, over all the houses of merriment, over this city of revelry. For the palace will be abandoned, the noisy city deserted, the citadel and watchtower will become barren, waste forever. The delight of wild donkeys and a pasture for flocks, until the Spirit from on high is poured upon us. And the desert becomes a fertile field, and the fertile field seems like a forest. Wow. Okay. Let's take a look at it in the King James. Somehow the ISV flows a little smoother, but let's see what it says here in Isaiah 32. Rise up, ye women that are at ease. Hear my voice, you careless daughters. Give ear unto my speech. Many days and years shall ye be troubled, ye careless women, for the vintage shall fail, the gathering shall not come. Tremble, ye women that are at ease. Be troubled, ye careless ones. Strip you and make you bare, and gird sackcloth upon your loins. And so the word careless ones is the same is the word batash, by the way. It means overconfident. It's the same word that we see in Ezekiel 39 in the prophecy thing. It's this the word careless is it's in false confidence is the flavor there. Moving on. They shall lament for the teats, for the pleasant fields, and for the fruitful vine. Upon the land of my people shall come up thorns and briars, yea, upon all the houses of joy and the joyous city. Because the palaces shall be forsaken, and the multitude of the city will be left. The forts and towers shall be for dens forever, a joy of wild asses, a pasture of flocks, until the Spirit be poured upon us from on high, and the wilderness be a fruitful field, and the fruitful field be counted for a forest. And obviously, verse 15 here is talking about the Spirit. It's the same thing that Joel talks about in Joel chapter 2. We deal with that so heavily when Peter explains it in Acts chapter 2. But moving on. The Spirit there, of course, is the Holy Spirit. Well, let's move on to verse 16, again continuing in the ISV, because it's dealing here with the restoration of God's reign. Isaiah says, then justice will live in wilderness, and righteousness shall dwell in the fertile field. The effect of righteousness shall be peace, and the result of righteousness shall be quietness and confidence forever. My people will live in peaceful dwellings, in secure homes, and in undisturbed resting places. But it will hail when the forest comes down, and the wood will be leveled completely. And how happy you will be, sowing your seed beside every stream, letting your cattle and your donkeys range freely. Well, let's see how the King James deals with it. The judgment shall dwell in the wilderness, the righteous will remain in the fruitful field, and the work of righteousness shall be peace, and the effect of righteousness, quietness, and assurance forever. And my people shall dwell in a peaceful habitation, in assured dwellings, and in quiet resting places. And when it shall hail coming down on the forest, and the city shall be low in a low place, blessed are ye that sow beside all waters, that send forth thither the feet of an ox and the ass. And now we go to chapter 33, continuing all this. Isaiah says, how terrible it will be for you, destroyer, you who have not been destroyed yourself. And how terrible it will be for you, traitor, one whom people have not betrayed. When you have sunk so low in destroying others, you will be destroyed. And when you have finished betraying, they will betray you. In the King James, again, we now have the sixth of the six woes, the way the King James renders it. Woe to thee that spoilest, and thou wast not spoiled, and dealest treacherously, and they have dealt not treacherously with thee. When thou shalt cease to spoil, thou shalt be spoiled. And when thou shalt make an end to deal treacherously, they shall deal treacherously with thee. And so all this, of course, the spoiler here in the local sense is, of course, is Sennacherib, the head of the Assyrian army, and who came against Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah, and we'll read that in detail in the reading section next week. But the main thrust here is a question of keeping promises, and this alludes to the covenant that Hezekiah made with Assyria to be left alone, which of course is going to get violated. But God will still deal with it, is the idea. So this is woe number 6 of 6, and it's the same list that we looked at before. So here we now, in all of this, we have a prayer for grace. And let's see it in the, and this will also apply to the final spoiler. There's a spoiler that Sennacherib is in the local sense, but the flavor here extends to the guy that we call the Antichrist, the coming world leader. But let's move on what he says here. Lord, be gracious unto us, we long for you, and be our strength every morning, our salvation in times of trouble. And at the thunder of your voice, the peoples flee. At your silence, the nations scatter. Your plunder is gathered as when grasshoppers gather, just like locust pounds, people have bounced on it. The Lord is exalted, for he lives on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness. He will be a sure foundation for your times. Abundance and salvation, wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is Zion's treasure. So that's the prayer that's inserted here in the first 6 verses. In the King James, it's pretty straightforward. O Lord, be gracious unto us. We've waited for thee. Be thou their aim every morning, our salvation also in a time of trouble. At the noise of the tumult, the people fled. At the lifting up of thyself, the nations were scattered. And your spoil shall be gathered like the gathering of the caterpillar, and as the running to and fro of locusts shall he run upon them. Strange idioms, actually. The Lord is exalted, for he dwelleth on high. He hath filled Zion with judgment and righteousness, and wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of our times, of thy times. And the strength of salvation and the fear of the Lord is his treasure. Pretty straightforward. Now let's get to chapter 33, verse 7. Listen, their brave men cry out in the streets. The envoys of peace weep bitterly. The highways are deserted. The travelers have quit the road. The enemy has broken treaties. He despises their witnesses. He respects no one. The land mourns and wastes away. Lebanon feels ashamed and withers. Sharon is like a desert. Bashan and Carmel shake off their leaves. And in the King James, it's pretty straightforward. Behold, their valiant ones shall cry without. The ambassadors of peace shall weep bitterly. The highways lie waste. The wayfaring man ceases. He hath broken the covenant. He hath despised the cities. He regardeth no man. Sennacherib violates the covenant that Hezekiah thought he had. So it speaks in a local sense, but it also echoes, if you will, Daniel 9, verse 27, the final covenant that's violated by the world leader that leads, of course, to the Great Tribulation and Armageddon. And we'll talk more about that. He hath broken the covenant. In other words, this has 2 applications. Sennacherib in the local sense, but in the broader sense, it refers to the guy that we tend to call the Antichrist, or what I like to call the coming world leader. And so we'll move on here. And so, okay. The earth mourneth and languisheth. Lebanon is ashamed and hewn down. Sharon is like a wilderness. Bashan and Carmel shake off their fruits. Now, the word Lebanon, by the way, Lebanon means white, you see. So it's the northern mountains, about 120 miles of snow-covered cedars and firs. That's Lebanon. That's the flavor of it. Sharon is at the foot of Mount Carmel, and it's known for flowers and forests. So these are idioms that speak in broader terms than just the local application. And Carmel divides Sharon from Escalon, and it's rocky hills and so forth. And Bashan, the area that we think of the Golan Heights, Bashan is a portion of what we think of today as Transjordan, as upland from Hermon to Gilead. And it's known for forests of oak and also wild cattle. So this is idiomatically describing desolation that's to come, is what it's really saying. And the most beautiful regions, in effect, will be withered away, is the flavor of the language here in the King James. Well, God is exalted. Isaiah says, now I'll raise up, the Lord has said. Now I'll exalt myself. Now I'll be lifted up. You conceive dried grass. You give birth to stubble. Your breath is a fire that will consume you. And the peoples will be burned as if to ashes. Like cut thorn bushes, they will be set ablaze. Those who are far away have heard what I have done, and those who are near have acknowledged my power. The sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling grips the godless. Who among us can live with the consuming fire? Who among us can live with the everlasting flames? The one who walks righteously and has spoken sincere words, who rejects gain from extortion and waves his hand, rejecting bribes, who blocks his ears from hearing plots of murder and shuts his eyes against seeing evil. This is the one who will live on the heights. His refuge will be a mountain fortress. His food will be supplied and his water be guaranteed. You know, this flavor may confuse you because on the one hand, Israel is not deserving of protection. On the other hand, God is going to step in, and even though they're going to be judged, he will step in and deal with their persecutors. There's a real parallel of this in Ezekiel 36 and 37 and 38. As God deals with Israel there in chapter 36 especially, he points out, I do this not because you deserve it, but because my name is on the deal. And if you studied Ezekiel 36, 37, 38, you know what the same flavors here. That God does step in and protect Zion, but it's not because they deserve it. He's doing it because he's committed to doing that. We'll continue going here. Verse 17. Your eyes will see the king in his elegance and will view a land that stretches afar. Your mind will ponder at the time of terror. Where is the king's accountant? Where is the one who weighed the revenue? Where is the officer who supervised the towers? No longer will you see those arrogant people, those people with their obscure speech you cannot comprehend, stammering in a language that you cannot understand. Look at Zion, city of your festivals. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an undisturbed abode and a movable tent. Its stakes will never be pulled up, nor will any of its ropes be broken. But there the Lord in majesty will be for us our source of broad rivers and streams, where no galley with oars can go, where no stately ship can sail. For the Lord is our judge, and the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our king, and he it is who will save us. Verse 22 is a very important verse. I'll come back to that when you get to the King James here. But moving on here. Your rigging hangs loose. It cannot reliably hold the mast in its place. The sail cannot spread out. Then an abundance of spoils will be divided. Even the lame will carry off plunder. And no one living there will say, I'm ill. The people living there will have their sins forgiven. So that's the promise that lurks behind all of this here. Let's look at it in the King James, picking up at verse 10, 33 verse 10. Now will I rise, said the Lord. Now will I be exalted. Now will I lift up myself. Ye shall conceive chaff, and ye shall bring forth stubble. Your breath as fire shall devour you, and the people shall be as burnings of lime. As thorns cut up, they shall be burned in the fire. Hear, ye that are far off, what I have done, and ye that are near, acknowledge my might. The sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearlessness hath surprised the hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? Now, in the devouring fire, that's actually a phrase, strange enough, right out of Deuteronomy 4. But we'll keep moving here for a number of reasons. He that walketh righteously and speaketh uprightly, he that despiseth the gain of oppressions, that shaketh his hands from the holding of bribes, that stoppeth his ears from the hearing of blood, and shutteth his eyes from seeing evil, he shall dwell on high. His place of defense shall be munitions of rocks. Bread shall be given him, and his water shall be sure. Here, this is one of those places where even the King James flows well, I think. But moving on here. Thine eyes shall see the king in his beauty. They shall behold the land that is very far off. Thine heart shall meditate the terror. Where is the scribe? Where is the receiver? Where is he that counteth the towers? And these are quotes read out of Psalm 15, by the way, but we'll move on here. Thou shalt not see a fierce people, a people of deeper speech than thou canst perceive, of a stammering tongue that thou canst not understand. Now, look on Zion, the city of our solemnities. Thine eye shall see Jerusalem, a quiet habitation, a tabernacle that shall not be taken down. Not one of the stakes thereof shall ever be removed, neither shall any of the cords thereof be broken. Strange passage, because on the one hand he's going to bat for them, but at the same time he's also promising them that they won't be destroyed, they'll be protected. That's really what it's saying here. And but there the glorious Lord will be unto us a place of broad rivers and streams, wherein shall go no galley with oars, neither shall any gallant ship pass thereby. That may confuse you, by the way, because we think of Jerusalem, one of the things that makes Jerusalem so unique on the planet Earth, it's obviously the most controversial city on the planet Earth. And when you study that, it makes no sense, because here's a city that has no natural resources, it's not on any caravan routes, it has no harbor, there's no water access, there's no reason for Jerusalem to be significant on the face of it in worldly terms. And yet, the entire world trembles today, wondering what to do about Jerusalem. And that's what Zechariah talks about, that it's become a cup of trembling to all the nations. Whoever addresses Jerusalem will get a global hernia, is what the King James actually says in Zechariah 12. So, but you see what you and I overlook is what Zechariah 4 talks about, because there's going to be a gigantic earthquake. And it's going to be a source of water When the Lord comes back, there's going to be huge, huge topographical changes. And we don't think of it that way, understandably. But having said all that, I want to call your attention to verse 22, because most people have no grasp of the significance of verse 22. Let's look at it very carefully. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He will save us. Thy tacklings are loose, they could not well strengthen their mast, they could not spread the sail. Then is the prey of the great spoil divided, the lame take the prey. The inhabitant shall not say, I am sick, the people that dwell therein shall be forgiven their iniquity. That's the promise. Okay, let's move on to chapter 34. And you can probably tell that I'm very excited about getting to a conclusion, what I call Unit 1 in Isaiah, because we've had a lot of judgment. But bear with me as we go on here. See, judgment has been the theme all the way through this entire section. And we've looked at 6 woes, and they've called it a progression all the way through this prophecy. We saw a local situation in which Isaiah spoke, and then we watched him move into a broader area as he looked down through the centuries to see the time of judgment that we call the Great Tribulation coming. So we saw both of these in place. Let's look at sort of a summary here in chapter 34. Come near, you nations, to listen and pay attention, you peoples. Let the earth hear and all that fills it, the world and all that comes out of it. For the Lord is angry against all the nations. And by the way, understand biblical vocabulary. Israel is not one of the nations. There's Israel and the nations. And we need to be sensitive to that. God, it's always Israel as God's chosen. And that doesn't mean they do things right. They're judged too. But the point is, God uses them as the benchmark and the nations. For the Lord is angry against all the nations and furious against all their armies. He has doomed them to destruction and given them up to be slaughtered. That's quite a verse. Chapter, there's no wiggle room here. It's pretty straightforward. Their slain will be thrown out, and as for their dead bodies, their stench will ascend. The mountains will be soaked with their blood. This is probably as strong a language as you'll find in the Bible. And what's God talking about? The nations. He's not singing, he's all the nations. That's the way he feels about it. Let's understand that. The valleys will be split, and all the stars in the heavens will fall down. Really? And the skies will be rolled up like a scroll. All their starry host will fade away like leaves withering on a vine, or fruit withering on a fig tree. You know, it's interesting. There's one thing the ISV seems to capture is the eloquence of Isaiah. We sometimes, while I like the King James, we lose the flow here. I really like what the ISV's done here. And so, for my sword will be seen in the heavens. Look, it descends in judgment on Edom, on the people I have doomed to destruction. The Lord has a sword bathed in blood. It's covered with fat, and the blood of lambs and goats, and with fat from the kidneys of rams. Now the ISV, strangely here, by the way, stops halfway through verse 6. It leaves half of it in this parsing, and will pick up the other half in the next parsing. And they've chosen to do it that way for whatever. And we'll take a look at that. Let's see how this looks in the King James. Come near, ye nations, to hear. And hearken, ye people, let the earth hear, and all that is therein, the world, and all things that come forth of it. No partitioning going on. The world at large here. For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them. He hath delivered them to the slaughter. And that's probably the strongest possible expressions that could be used. The judgment is universal, and it's severe. The Lord spoke of this as a time of suffering that will be unparalleled. Jesus himself described this time as a time of unparalleled suffering in the history of mankind. That's what's coming. And so there's a shift, obviously there's a shift of emphasis here to all the nations, not just Jerusalem or Israel, they're separate here. And by the way, it's not focusing on their specific enemies, it's focusing on the world in general. And that's where you really get the flavor when you study the book of Revelation from chapter 6 through 19 is a broad judgment coming on the planet Earth. Their slain shall also be cast out, their stink shall come up out of their carcasses, the mountains shall be melted with their blood, and all the host of heaven shall be dissolved. Wow, host of heaven, that term for stars, planets, whatever, shall be dissolved. And the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. Boy, how interesting it is. We think of space as empty, and yet that's because we're not paying attention to science. We know space has properties. It has dimensionalities. And we know it's four-dimensional, not three, because it can be rolled as a scroll. The scripture said that all along. And all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf fall off from the vine and as a falling fig from the fig tree. And so this is probably the most terrible and repulsive in the Bible here in verse 3 and 4. And the same language here that you're seeing in verse 4 is in Revelation 6, verse 13 and 14. And if you want more background on that, we have some of our materials on the boundaries of reality. When you really understand what science has taught us about the uniqueness, this subset of reality that we think of reality, it's a subset of a larger reality. And when you understand that, all this is astonishingly contemporary language for what we now understand. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved. Wow. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse to judgment. Now, Idumea is the Greek term for Edom. If you're an Edomite, you live in Idumea. Now, God has a specific judgment against Edom on the one hand. It is also used idiomatically for the traditional enemies of Israel. So you can see it in two ways here, in a denotative or in a connotative sense, depending on you're looking here. The word Idumea. But let's look at the next verse. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and goats, and with the fat of kidneys of rams. And this is where a strange thing occurs, because this is where the ISV decides to parse it, the last part of this, into the next parsing here. For the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. So the ISV has chosen to split it there. And so for whatever it's worth, we'll just go on here. You need to, as you study your Bible, you need to understand the history of Edom. And Moses, in his days, Moses was denied passage, you may recall, in Numbers 20. They wanted to get through that region, and the Edomites would not let them go through. David later subdues them in 2 Samuel 9. There's a revolt under Jeroboam in 2 Chronicles 21. They smote Judah under Ahaz, and they were always ready to shed blood, we know from Ezekiel 35. But they will be cut off, according to Obadiah, which is the whole book of Obadiah, is on the judgment that's coming on Edom. And so Esau, when you say Edom is the region, Esau is the inhabitant. He was the twin of Jacob. Jacob and Esau fought in the womb before they were even born. And Obadiah 3 attributes the sin of pride to Edom. That's the focus. And Jeremiah 49 deals with that. Esau is to serve Jacob in the prophecies of Genesis 25 and 27. You may recall when Nebuchadnezzar is taking Judah in captivity, the Edomites were on the periphery cheering their enemies on and saying, take the children and smash their brains against the rocks, is what the Edomites were telling the Nebuchadnezzar soldiers to do. They were cheering the plight of Judah. And that still echoes in the Psalms, by the way. And now Edom will be a possession for Judah, according to Numbers 24. But they are cursed in Amos and Malachi and so forth. In fact, I don't want to get into derail a whole study of Edom here, but I'm going to encourage you to understand where they came from. Don't fall for the narrowness that they're south east of the Dead Sea. That's what your maps show in your Bibles. No, 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 because they're driven westward by the Nabateans, and they create a country called Idumea, where Hebron is their capital, on the west side of the Dead Sea. And even if you look at the Roman maps in the first century, they still show a country called Idumea. But they are the enemies of Israel. And what I want to point, the reason I want you to spend some time to understand that, because they have a contemporary role that you won't understand unless you understand the history of the Edomites, which I won't try to recap here. But the judgment against Edom is mentioned in more Old Testament books than it is against any other foreign nation. You'll discover very quickly that Edom is singled out for God's indignation for a lot of different reasons, all driven by pride and what have you, but still. So I want you to just make that a take. For those of you that are diligent, I encourage you to just give yourself an assignment to dig into the background of Edom, and we'll move on here for now. Now, in the when the King James takes up this parsing, it starts with the last half of verse 6. For the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. Now, that's where for some reason the ISV chose to break that. Now, Bozrah or Petra refers to the word sheepfold, depending whether you're talking about Hebrew or Greek, if you will. Bozrah is the Hebrew, Petra is the Greek, but both terms mean a sheepfold, which means an area that you have a controlled entrance into. And the area there in Bozrah or Petra is dramatic in this very, very narrow entrance that lets you into this huge, huge sanctuary, or a place where you could hide millions of people there if you wanted to. And so Bozrah, Petra, and you can check that out in your scripture as we go on here. It may be using that term literally, denotatively. It also could be using it connotatively to speak of Edom in a broader sense. We're going to discuss that in more detail when we get to Isaiah 63. Because many people don't realize that when the Lord comes back on a second coming, he comes back to Bozrah first to fight for the remnant that is hidden there. And we'll talk about all of that in Isaiah 63 when we get there, but we'll move on now. Let's move on to chapter 34, starting in the middle of verse 6. For the Lord holds a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Wild oxen will fall together with them, so young steers and mighty bulls. Their land will be drenched with blood, and their soil will be swollen with fat. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for Zion's cause. Edom's streams will be turned into burning sulfur, and its dust into sulfur. Its land will become pitch. It will burn night and day. It will never be extinguished. Wow. Its smoke will rise from generation to generation, and it will lie desolate forever and ever, and no one will pass through it. But hawks and hedgehogs will possess it. Owls and ravens will nest in it. God will stretch out over a measuring line, and chaos and plumb lines and of emptiness, and its nobles. They will name it no kingdom there, and all its princes will come to nothing. Wow, it's not finished. It goes on. Thorns will grow over its palaces, nettles and brambles its fortresses. It will become a haunt for jackals, a home for ostriches. And desert creatures will meet with hyenas, and goat demons will call out to each other. There also Liliths will settle and find for themselves a resting place. Owls will nest there, lay eggs, hatch them, and care for their young under the shadow of their wings. Yes, indeed, vultures will gather there, each one with its mate. Well, let's take a look at this in the King James. I want to point out something about the vocabulary here. For the Lord had a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. And the unicorns, that's a strange term for us to hear at our ears, and the speculation is that may be referring to rhinoceros by some of the commentators. But anyway, shall come down with him, and the bullocks with bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust shall be made fat with fatness. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of recompenses for the controversy of Zion. And streams thereof will be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone, and the land shall thereof become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night or day. The smoke thereof shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. And by the way, Malachi, 300 years later, says essentially the same thing in this chapter, first chapter of his writings. And he says, in the way the Malachi thing reads, I hated Esau and had laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. And it goes on that way. But the point I want to make here as we go on here, the vocabulary of these animals may be synecdoches. They may be expressed connotatively. There's a lot of debate among the expositors as to what are these specifically. But the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it, the owl also and the raven shall dwell in it, and he shall stretch out upon it a line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. And they shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all her princes shall be nothing. Now, are these really a pelican or a porcupine? There's all kinds of speculation by some of the expositors as to what the Hebrew really refers to. In this last verse, the nobles in Huram, Edom took the land from the Horites. So there's a justification for viewing the vocabulary here as in an idiomatic of demons, not the animals that we tend to visualize. And in the flavor of the whole passage, it wouldn't surprise me what this may be just a way of referring, just as in both Revelation and elsewhere, locusts are often used as an idiom for demons, not just literal locusts. Because we know literal locusts have no king, and the locusts in Revelation have a king, and from that you can come to some interesting expository conclusions. But clearly what's going on here may be far spookier than just the fact that we have a desolate piece of geography. And the thorns shall come up in their places, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof, and it shall be a habitation of dragons, and a court for owls, or ostriches, or whatever. The word for jackals is actually the howling ones. And the word for owls is the daughters of screaming. So these may be idioms with a broader purview than we normally would ascribe to them. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow, and the screech owl shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. I have no idea what it's referring to, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that these terms are more spooky than we generally would ascribe to them. And I don't think you'd find the description of these in a biological textbook, in other words. Dragons in a court for owls, whatever that really means. And there shall be a great owl make her nest and lay and hatch and gather under her shadow, and there shall be vultures be gathered, every one with her mate. The word for great owl in the Hebrew might be a arrow snake or it might be an owl. Who knows? The expositors argue and they're not sure themselves. Let's move on then to the certainty of God's deliverance. Starting verse 16. Study and read from the book of the Lord, and not one will be missing. Each will not long for its mate. For it is the mouth of the Lord that has issued the order, and it is the Spirit who has gathered them. It is he who has allotted their portions, and his hand has divided it for them with a measuring line forever. They will possess it forever. From generation to generation, they will live in it. And in the King James, seek ye out the book of the Lord and read, no one of these shall fail, none shall want her mate. From my mouth it hath commanded, and his Spirit it hath gathered them. And he hath cast the lot for them, his hand hath divided unto them by line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation shall they dwell therein. So let's wrap it up in the last chapter here, chapter 35, this session anyway. The future of Israel's land. The desert and the dry land will rejoice. The desert will celebrate and blossom like crocuses. It will burst into bloom and rejoice with gladness and shouts of joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. See, these are being restored then. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands and support the stumbling knees. And it's interesting how there's a sort of poetic justice here, because in this chapter it concludes this section on judgment by dealing with a positive note here going on. Say to those with anxious hearts, be strong, do not be afraid. He is your God. He will bring vengeance. He will bring divine retribution, and he will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unblocked. For the lame shall leap like deer, and the tongues of the speechless people will sing for joy. Yes, waters will gush forth in the wilderness, and the streams will run through the desert. And the burning sands will become a pool, and the thirsty ground fountains of water. In the haunts of jackals there will be a verdant resting place with reeds and rushes. Pretty straightforward. In the King James, it pretty much carries the same. The wilderness and solitary place shall be glad for them. The desert shall rejoice and blossom as a rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice even with the joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it. The excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of God. So this is an echoing the inverse of what we read earlier. Strengthen ye the weak hands, confirm the feeble knees. Say unto them that are of a fearful heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with a vengeance, even God with a recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. And that may sound familiar to your ears, because in Matthew 11, you may recall John the Baptist sent his disciples to check out, to make sure that, for them to check out that Jesus really was the thing, and that's exactly what he said. Go tell them, the eyes of the blind shall be opened, deaf. He uses those as his credentials, if you will. The eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing, and in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert, and parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water, and the habitation of dragons, where each lay shall be grass with reeds and rushes. So even the King James is pretty straightforward. And so let's get to verse 8. And a highway shall be there. Yes, there. The people will call it the Holy Way. It's interesting that in the New Testament, the Christian walk was called the Way. You may recall that was the first identity of it. The people will call it the Holy Way. As for unclean people, they will not journey on it, but it will be for whomever is traveling on the way. Not even fools will get lost. No lions will be there, no, nor will any ferocious beast be up on it, and they will not be found there. But the redeemed will walk there, and the Lord's ransomed ones will return and enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will rest upon their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and mourning will flee away. Well, in the King James, a high will be there, and a way, and it should be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, and it shall be for those. The wayfaring men, the fools will not err therein. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast shall go up thereon, and it shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And again, we got the highway, the way of God, the way of holiness. They that walk in the way, if you will. And the ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Praise his holy name. So we've wrapped up the heavy part of what some people call the first Isaiah, if you will. And so we've just finished essentially the final session of Unit 1, except in these 5 chapters, we have one session left which we're going to include in Unit 1, and that's a strange historical parenthesis of these chapters, 4 chapters, chapters 36 through 39. Up till now, the whole style of Isaiah has been poetic, if you will. And if you look at the ISV especially, they parsed it like poetry, if you will. But in chapters 36 through 39, it's prose, it's history, and it's going to wrap up this session, if you will. So for your next session, to prepare for that, what I want you to do is read 2 Kings 18 through 20, 18, 19, and 20, if you will. The same passage is also summarized in 2 Chronicles chapters 29 and 30. They're both pretty much the same, if you will. But if you're going to be thorough, read one or both of those historical narratives as background, and then I want you to study carefully the 4 chapters we'll deal with next time. Chapters 36, which is all about Hezekiah's problem, his trouble. He's got the cloud of the Assyrian invasion threat hanging over him. Chapter 37 is his prayer. He prays to God in chapter 37. In chapter 38, he gets ill, and God extends his life, interestingly enough. And then chapter 39 is he makes a fool of himself. So we have 4 chapters: Hezekiah's trouble, his prayer, his illness, and his folly. It's a historical interlude before we get into what I consider the dessert of Isaiah, chapter 40 on. And that's, we'll call that Unit 2. But Unit 1 is a package. Now, there are 3 significant miracles that you'll encounter in the next session. The death angel is going to slay 185,000 Assyrians. So God makes good his commitment to them. And, and we'll see that in chapter 37. We also have this very peculiar event occur in Isaiah 38, where the sun retreats 10 degrees on the sundial. And we'll talk about that next time. And then, of course, God heals Hezekiah and extends his life 15 years. And we'll take a look at that. Now, what's so strange about this historical parenthesis is it appears in the Bible 3 times. It appears in the 2 Kings passage I mentioned. It shows up in the 2 Chronicles passage I mentioned. And it's also given 4 chapters in the book of Isaiah. So God must have some very, very crucial significance to these 4 chapters that we're going to look at next time. And when we do that, that will finish what we call Unit 1. Now, if you're like me, you can't resist looking ahead a little bit. So that's enough of reading assignment. But give me a little glimpse here. When we go on, after next time, we're going to go into what we call Unit 2. We're dividing our whole study of Isaiah into 2 parts. Unit 1 that we've just finished, and we will have finished next week. And then we have Unit 2, which is chapters 40 through 66. And when you read from chapter 40 on, you will understand why so many people felt that this was a separate Isaiah. It's going to sound so different that you can understand why many scholars say this is a different guy with the same name. That's not true, by the way. Don't fall into that trap. Because in John 12, we know from the New Testament that it's the same Isaiah. Both Isaiah 1 and Isaiah is the same guy. The scripture makes that very clear. But you can understand when you get into chapters 40 and following why you will experience the eloquence and the exhilaration of the messages are so different than we've been plodding through. You probably noticed we're sort of dragging through all these judgments against all the nations, and I'm ready for chapter 40 on. To be frank with you, I can hardly wait, because there are surprises on every page, and it'll be a fun time. Now, if you're like me, you probably can't resist the impulse to read on ahead of next week's assignment. And my suggestion is go ahead, feast your souls, okay? But with that, let's you and I bow our hearts for a closing word of prayer.